Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. In this episode, I chat with Aviva Levin, a passionate podcaster who loves interviewing educators about their practice as the host of Lesson Impossible, an exploration of educational innovation. She was a teacher in Canada for 10 years and is now a grad student as well as an enthusiastic volunteer and professional development presenter in Washington State. During our chat, we acknowledge that there are issues within education and explore the ideas of rebuilding within the system or designing something new and innovative. We also discuss how lonely it can be when we push back against common practices, but how we can find like-minded individuals and use those connections to help make those necessary changes. In exploring the obstacles and changing the narrative, Aviva points out that there is often a disconnect between the experiences of our educators and those of our students. Teachers strive to bridge that gap, but are fearful because of doing it wrong or even being ostracized by peers for not adhering to the norm. Despite this, she encourages everyone to live their values, understanding that not everyone will agree with them. She also suggests developing solutions, something that can be done by starting small within your own space and not simply pointing out the problems that exist. I hope that you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. Hello, Aviva, and welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. You know, we initially spoke as me being your guest, and now we've reversed those roles, and you are on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. I'm in this, I feel like a liminal space where my state in Washington is not ready to lift the quarantine necessarily, but some stuff is starting to open up. And we went to a park that we hadn't visited in a while and stayed far away from people. So it's just in that transition space for not knowing what's happening for my friends and colleagues in education, just sitting back and waiting, which I think for a lot of teachers that love control is not the best place to be. We love to know what's going to happen, but I'm trying my best to just sit with it and wait to see what happens.
All right. Yeah, it is kind of nice, that things are opening. I know my wife and I have had that conversation a lot to say, at what point are we going to feel comfortable, right? Just because it's open doesn't mean that we're rushing out into the fray. And nothing against individuals who feel comfortable doing it, but we're like, at what point are we going to feel comfortable kind of reintroducing ourselves to society, if you will?
Yeah, it's a hard line. And I think it's different for everyone. It's different for kids or people with kids, depending on what kind of condition you have. But it's been interesting as well seeing schools struggle with that too. Like if you've got a building full of teachers who have different comfort levels, how do you get them all back into the building at the same time and still feel safe?
Yeah, there are going to be some very interesting conversations moving forward, just surrounding that as a whole. But, before we continue too far, can you do me a favor and just introduce yourself to our listeners. Let them know who you are, what you do in education, and just kind of, your journey thus far.
Absolutely. So my name is Aviva Levin, and I was a French and social studies teacher in British Columbia, Canada for 10 years. And then fairly recently, or not so recently, it's been over a year now, I moved with my husband to Seattle, Washington. And so, due to visa issues and the way that immigration works, I'm not legally able to work, even though I am qualified in Washington. And facing a lot of free time, I really did some introspection about what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to stay involved in education. And I knew that I wanted to meet new people in Washington and I wanted to learn a new skill. So, putting that together, I decided that I was going to start my own podcast, which is called Lesson Impossible. And it's based on the Mission Impossible theme. And the idea is finding educators around the world that are doing innovative things like yourself and just trying to bring those ideas and motivation to teachers that are listening. Because I think we all know people in our buildings, and the only time you ever know that they're doing amazing things is if you see their stuff by the photocopier or someone tells you about it. So just trying to make it more available to everybody about what people are doing, share some of the not so great parts too, because I think especially in the first years of teaching, you need to know that everybody's failing around you too.
Oh, yeah.
And just have a sense of a broader education community. So it's been an adventure, but I'm almost on my first year, September to June, of podcasting, and really enjoying it so far, but very big learning curve.
I can only imagine. And so, with you speaking with educators, from not just around the country here, but around the world, what are some things, or have you noticed any trends in the way that people are trying to challenge the narrative around education?
Absolutely. I think, and this is a question that I often ask my guests as well, because it's on my mind, which is really grappling with the question of, do you try and rebuild within the system and build a better system? Or is it something that just needs to be knocked down and started again? And I think that depending on where people are physically, geographically, personally, that answer changes from person to person. But I haven't talked to anyone who is happy with the status quo, which I think says a lot about teachers as much as it does just the system in general. I also see so many teachers using their connections to create change, but on the other hand, something that I also notice is that there's a certain amount of loneliness. I was actually talking about that with my latest guest, Lauren Porosoff, that if you're truly an innovator, which a lot of these people are, it can be incredibly lonely because you feel like you're fighting and nobody else knows what you're going through. And so I think that teachers know that they need to find those connections to make change, but it can also be a little frustrating to find those connections, which I think is also where social media often comes in and is that bridge. And, I think the last thing is just, I'm always floored by the different ways that people create change. Like from my own point of view, it's like, oh, well, if I was going to change blank, it would obviously be this. A question that I ask all of my guests is, if you could build an ideal school curriculum classroom, what would it be? And I'm always amazed at how wildly different every answer is, which I think also goes to show just how different teachers are in their own communities. But the one thing that always is the same in everybody's answer is they want more time to collaborate and they want more flexibility and space, especially a lot of outdoor space to be able to explore with their students.
So based on what you've heard thus far, is there any one story that maybe sticks out to you that says, hey, this is what we're talking about in education, right? This is really embodies what we are trying to do, and yet maybe is not the common, story, that is out there. I think, that this whole pandemic has really made people look at education differently, and I am super excited for, where that may end up. But do you have any maybe those success stories of somebody out there saying, "Hey, we're just really changing the face of education," or at least how people are talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, another one of your guests, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, is definitely someone who comes to mind who's really thinking deeply about how COVID is affecting our education system, what needs to happen in our education system, and really challenging the narratives, I think, around education. I think, which, obviously that's the title of your podcast, but I think everyone's a little bit on a different place in their journey of how much they're willing to follow the traditional narrative. And some people are beginning to say, like, oh, who wrote this narrative? Oh, maybe I don't fit in this narrative. And Kwame is definitely a person who's like, yeah, that narrative's been in the recycling bin for like at least 10 years. And I'm writing my own thing right now. In terms of a story that sticks out for me, I don't know if I'd necessarily qualify it as positive, but when I was teaching, or when I was talking to Letizia and Humphrey Ballantyne, who's a teacher in Mississippi, she was teaching in a low-income school with students with a lot of needs, and she was talking about how she left the profession, and the straw that broke the camel's back for her was that she had a food closet for her students where she was gathering and herself buying food for hungry students. And her administration just one day came in and took it all away from her.
Oh, wow.
And said, you didn't follow proper district procedures. We can't let you have this. And that was kind of it for her. And I recently talked to someone who'll be a guest later around the idea of teacher attrition and how many people we lose in the profession. So I think for me, the story has been, how are people staying in? How are people not burning out? And then how are they able to affect change that doesn't, in many ways, break them because they care so much and the system resists so much? Which it probably isn't the most positive thing to start on, but it's definitely something that I think about a lot. Just depending on teacher situations, they really are like Sisyphus. You're pushing that boulder up the hill, and there's so many factors that are just pushing it back down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that I ask, are just, you've just touched on it, are those obstacles, right? There are people out there who want to create change, who understand that something needs to be different. But then you have, things pop up like, like your guest from, Mississippi who, hey, I'm going to do this thing. And then yet somehow it's destroyed or taken out from underneath them. And so do you have any other ideas about maybe what are some obstacles or even the reasons why people may be hesitant to step forward and make that change?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, especially as an outsider coming into a new educational system. Like when I and don't get me wrong, BC and Canada has its own host of issues. It is not perfect at all. But coming in to the American system, I had an idea of what it was going to be like. And I understood, okay, I'm going to be stepping onto land and be really in many ways the beneficiary of colonization and of years of inequality that allowed me, a white person, to now live in this place. And understanding that intellectually really hasn't been the same as kind of sitting with it and seeing that play out in almost every single school and with every single teacher that I've talked to. And there's certainly people that are way more qualified than me to speak on the issue. But I think sometimes what I see is the biggest divide is that disconnect between the teacher and their experiences, the students and their lived experiences, trying to bridge that gap, and a feeling, especially from some of the teachers, that either they're not supported in doing that or that they're just scared to do that because they're afraid that they're going to do something wrong. And so I'd say, for my observation, I'd say huge is just in many ways sometimes, and this is not to blame teachers at all, but there are elements of fear when you try and create change. There's the fear that you're doing it wrong. There's the fear you're going to be reprimanded. And maybe you do have just an awful administration that doesn't support you. There's the fear that you're going to be ostracized by your colleagues. A girlfriend of mine who I really admire had a teacher come into her one day and tell her that, I talked to the other people on our grade team, and you need to stop doing this stuff because you're making us look bad.
Oh, wow.
And the thing is like, I've heard versions of a similar story from more than one person. And so you don't want to stick out too much, but the nature of being a change maker is you're ahead of the curve. You're standing out there and you're pointing out that there's a problem, and you just have to make sure that, nobody gets mad at you for doing that. And a lot of time, we have shoot the messenger, we have the allegory of Plato's cave. Like, we've got all these lessons where it's like, you know what? Not everyone is appreciative when you point out the glaring problems in a system.
I'm so glad that you said those things, because you're absolutely right. There are individuals out there who, they are talking, this big talk, right, if you will. And I think, I came up with this mindset. In fact, when I was speaking to you about this concept of beyond hashtags, right? Everybody wants to promote these grand ideals, but very often they're not actually doing anything. And so when there are individuals out there who start pushing that envelope and say, well, let's make these changes happen, it's finding that balancing act of saying, how can I make change happen while not being, ousted? And so, yeah, I can imagine being fearful and not knowing how to move forward despite seeing, the things that are wrong, around you. And so I guess that would lead me into the next question is, do you have any tips or ideas, strategies, if you will, for a listener who might be sitting there thinking to themselves, yeah, Aviva, I'm in that same boat right now. I want to do something at my school, but I'm afraid of the potential backlash. Do you have any words of wisdom, if you will?
I wish I had more, but I have some small ideas that I think could be helpful. I think the first one is that starting in your class is the most important. And I think that often we want to stand up in the staff meeting and say, there's this huge problem, or in your department meeting and say, there's this huge problem, and we all need to work together to do something. And then because they're all teachers, it's like herding cats. But I think that if you do something in your classroom and you're working and living your values in your classroom, it's much easier to say there was a problem, or there still is a problem, but I've done something that is working. Would you be willing to give it a try? And that way you're not just hoisting the problem, and you're giving teachers something that they can work with that is doable. And to be frank, they don't have to think too much about it. They just know that it works. And maybe the thinking of the why comes after the how. So that, I think, would be something that I would say for teachers. And I think the idea to follow on that is that idea of living your values. Like, if you're going beyond the hashtags, if you're not just, tacking on at the end, like, yes, and, oh, of course, income equality is an issue too, and moving on, but actually in conversation, addressing it. But again, you don't have to make it the other person's problem, but just saying, I'm noticing this. These are some of the things that I would do. Maybe I'm going to apply for this grant. Would you care to join me? And just being a person so that your actions really do stay out there and speak louder than words. Because we all know, gosh, teachers love to talk. As I say now on a podcast, and I have my own podcast where I talk a lot. But those actions, I think when people see you doing something, then you're going to start getting the like, hey, I saw you do this and that. Or, oh, I heard that comment you made in the staff room or the staff meeting. I know no one really reacted to it, but I was thinking about it. Or, oh, I was talking to my student who's also in your class, and he said this, and I thought that was really cool. Can you tell me more? And then, you just start having a presence in your community where when there is time to make change, maybe an administrator comes and taps you on the shoulder. Maybe another teacher in the building invites you into a committee. So that would be my advice.
And that is great advice. I like when you said, don't make it their problem, even though it is their problem as well. It's not about you pointing that out and saying, hey, here's this big issue, but instead saying, I have a solution for this thing that we're all facing. If you want it, it's here, it's yours. But more than that is just demonstrating that. I like that. Live your value, and just consistently demonstrate through your actions, what you believe in. And just making it become a reality, not just for yourself, but for everyone in your community, whatever that community may be. So thank you.
No problem. And I personally have some examples of that happening. There was a teacher that I got into, I wouldn't say a fight because we had a lot of mutual professional respect, but our voices certainly got really loud in the copy room around the idea of what should and shouldn't be taught in a social studies curriculum. And my point of view that if we're going to be teaching revolution, it doesn't have to be the French one. It can be the Haitian Revolution. It could be any revolution as long as students understand what a revolution is. And this particular teacher was like, absolutely not. There needs to be a canon, a common knowledge. I'm sure you know all of the social studies fights about what shouldn't be taught. And we'd have these snippety fights constantly. And then finally I was like, well, I'm not going to wait for permission. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to teach it the way that I think it should be taught. It might be different than the way that my colleagues are teaching it, but I'm just going to do it. And it was a successful unit. And I will say that part of the unit, I definitely made sure to have my students create something that I posted out in the hallways of the school because I wanted it to be visible. And it ended up being like, a profile of a revolutionary and that kind of thing and this big project. And then that teacher, after she saw that a couple times and other people had commented on what they were seeing posted around the school, was like, oh, that looks interesting. Can I take a look? And maybe I'll addend that to my French Revolution unit. And to me, that was like the best solution, because I knew that they couldn't ever truly in their hearts throw out the French Revolution. They had to talk about Robespierre. And if they didn't, they felt that they were doing their students a disservice. But at least they were also adding on talking about civil rights and civil revolutions and, the Arab Spring. Even if it was for a little bit, I felt good in making that change in their practice and knowing that it never would have happened if we just sniped at each other in the copy room.
No, absolutely. And I like how you said that, you're just going to do it. And, I think one of the things, as you mentioned earlier, is that you stepped out there, right? You were that change agent, and it was like, okay, this thing was possible. this thing was positive and she's still here, right? I mean, it wasn't like, you were cast out of the building or anything. So it's like, okay, well, how can I take this and then now do it too, right? Like you took that risk step that everybody, or I would say maybe others wanted to take, but were too afraid to do it. And so you stepped up and said, hey, somebody has to do it. I'm going to do it. And then, it was adopted, maybe not, like you said, to the same caliber as what you were doing, but, some change is better than no change, right? So,
Yeah. And I will say that I was secure in my position at my school, and I had a really fantastic union rep and a really fantastic union, so that I knew that unless I was doing major damage to students, and I was confident enough in my pedagogy and my reasons, that I knew if for some reason I was ever called to task for what I was doing or saying, that I would be secure. And I know that that is not always something that all teachers are able to say. So yeah.
No, you definitely bring up a good point, is that we need to create those environments for each other. Like you were comfortable to say, hey, I know that if things go south, I have a support group that's going to lead me through this. Not only understanding that what you were doing was right because, you did your research. It wasn't just some, fancy of thing, that you wanted to do. But I think that is one of the things that we as educators need to be better at, of creating these support groups on multiple levels, from, teacher assistants, teachers, administrators, even beyond, to say, hey, we want to create environments where people can step out, can present these opportunities and feel safe, that if it fails or if it doesn't go their way, they know, there's a support group to kind of guide them through that. And so I'm glad, that you had that, and, that you initiated some change.
Thank you.
So you know what, Aviva, as we begin to wrap up here, I know that there is a lot of amazing work, and you of all people know that because you literally spend your time talking to all of these wonderful people. So I want to give an opportunity just for you, and I know that you've already mentioned a few individuals, but if you could just give, a few shout outs to people out there who, deserve some recognition for the great work that they're doing.
I'd say my first shout out would go to a group in Washington, the Equity and Education Coalition, and they're doing amazing work. They have these lunchtime seminars where they are bringing in speakers, and they also have these seminars, and everything they're doing is focused on and centering students of color and presenters of color. And I've done a lot of learning through them, and they've been very patient with me as the Canadian white girl that stepped in and was like, I think I know what's going on. And then they're like, oh, sweetheart, you don't. And so every single one of them and every single Lunch and Learn has really informed and made me a better person and a better teacher. So they get my biggest shout out and thank you if possible.
All right. Well, thank you. I was recouping from that when you were like the little, Canadian white girl who was like, I know this. And I was like, so Aviva, would you mind sharing with me, just how people can find you? I mean, I know that you mentioned the podcast, which I definitely want to include a link to the show. But beyond that, how can people, touch base with you and learn more about the work that you're doing?
So I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram at Aviva Levin, AVIVALEVIN. And you can find the podcast and more about me at www.lessonimpossible.com.
All right. Well, thank you, for everything that you're doing. The work that you're doing with the podcast, the impact that it's having on education, the work that you did while you were in the classroom, and hopefully, very soon, once again, I just want to say thank you for everything that you're doing. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. Actually,
I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and the host at _CW Consulting. Take care.